Almost nothing in American history is as misunderstood as the Great Depression. Here to debunk 7 all too prevalent myths about it, learn Liberty welcomes back.
I'm Anthony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and co-host of the weekly podcast Words and Numbers.
Myth number 2, President Herbert Hoover's laissez-faire economic policies caused the Great Depression.
This is very interesting because it's partially true. That is, Herbert Hoover's policies did exacerbate the Depression, but they weren't laissez-faire policies. That is, they weren't policies that were promoting free markets. They were policies that were promoting the control of the economy. And there are several things that Hoover did. One was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So Hoover was interested in protecting domestic industry from foreign competition. The tariffs made foreign imports much more expensive, and so Americans would have a tendency then to buy domestic goods rather than foreign goods. And that sounds very good on paper, except that the fewer foreign goods we purchase, the less money foreigners have to purchase American goods. And so you have a decline not only in imports coming to this country, but you have a decline in exports going out of the country. And this gets exacerbated by other countries that in retaliation impose tariffs on US exports. So this is the first thing that Hoover did. The second thing that Hoover did is he believed that the key to getting us out of recession, it wasn't a depression at this point, right? But it was a serious recession. The key to getting us out of that recession was to increase workers' purchasing power. And the way he did this was by strong-arming businesses not to reduce workers' wages. Keep those workers' wages up, he said, and this is going to help bring us out of the recession. Well, here's the problem. Herbert Hoover is saying that at the same time that the Federal Reserve is massively contracting the money supply. And the massive contraction in the money supply is causing prices of goods and services to fall. And so businesses are now caught in this pincer movement, where on the one side, the prices of their products are falling, on the other, they're under pressure to keep the wages up, and the businesses can't survive between these two forces. And so what do? Well, they start to lay off workers. If I can't cut back on my workers' wages, the next best thing is to lay some of them off to save money that way. And that contributed to what would eventually become a 25% sustained unemployment rate in this country. This is the second thing that Herbert Hoover did. The third thing that Herbert Hoover did was, in an attempt to protect American jobs, he put in place strict immigration controls. Not only did he reduce legal immigration to virtually zero, he increased efforts to deport illegal immigrants, which further exacerbated the problem of businesses that they can't afford to hire workers given that prices are falling. So when you look at the whole picture, you find that yes, Herbert Hoover's policies did contribute to an exacerbation of the recession, but they weren't laissez-faire policies. Things would have gone back to normal relatively quickly if it weren't for the various policies that were put into place. And I can give you an example of this. Almost all students know about the stock market crash of 1929. But when I ask them about the stock market crash of 1987, almost none of them have heard of it. The stock market crash of 1987 was of a magnitude similar to the stock market crash of 1929. And yet, 6 months later, there was no sign of a stock market crash. The economy went along and did its thing just as it did before. There was a bit of a recession thereabouts, but it wasn't any big deal. What was the difference? The difference was, in 1987, firstly, we didn't have all of these tariff and immigration policies that were enacted in 1929. Secondly, the Federal Reserve did the opposite of what the Federal Reserve did in 1929. In the wake of the stock market crash, the Federal Reserve panicked and contracted the money supply, which deprived banks and markets of the money they need to transact business. In 1987, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, the day after the crash, got on the news and said the Federal Reserve stands ready to make available as much liquidity as the markets need. And everybody breathed a sigh of relief that we wouldn't have to worry about the money supply being contracted. There'll be financing available, there'll be money available. And what happened? Yeah, it was a lot of people lost their shirts in the 1987 crash, but the phenomenon remained in financial markets. It didn't jump into goods and services and labor markets where it actually affects the guy on the street. And that's what happened in 1929. The Fed policies caused that shock to financial markets to jump into goods and services and labor markets, where it created real pain for real people, as opposed to simply losses on paper. FDR was seen as the great savior, that he's the one that brought us out of the Great Depression. Therefore, anything that came before must have been the cause of the Great Depression. And FDR's policies were even more progressive than Hoover's were. Another factor that contributes to this myth is that a lot of Herbert Hoover's policies that looked very much like FDR's New Deal policies were not enacted at the federal level. They were enacted at state levels. That is, rather than the federal government undertaking massive works and jobs programs directly, the federal government provided money to the states and encouraged the states to do so. So you saw much more activity on the state level, but that activity was being driven at the federal level. FDR's policies were based in large part on Hoover's policies before him, both progressive. One interesting thing to note is that FDR's policies, if you read into the history, were less directed at economic policy, as we tend to think of it today, than it was to social engineering. FDR in his brain trust had this idea that they could actually craft society into being something better than it was, and the way to do that was via these policies. So his thinking was less economic than it was social engineering.